All right, so today we are going to be talking about adding and punctuating quotes. So you are going to be starting on an essay where you are going to have to use quotes from experts, from texts, from the internet. And so there are a couple rules when we are adding quotes to our text. So, when we are in our body paragraphs, we need a topic sentence, and then at the end, we need a transition sentence. And so, the first and last sentence of a paragraph should not be a quote, it should be a topic sentence, and then the last sentence should be your transition sentence. So the quotes should be in the meat, in the center of your paragraphs. And this is because when you are adding quotations, you need to introduce or sandwich these quotes. So you need to introduce the quote. Here we've got the top bun. And then in the middle, you've got the quote itself. And then at the bottom bun, you explain the quote. So that's what it means when I say sandwich the quote. You introduce it, you have the quote itself, and then you explain the quote. The quote doesn't just stand on its own in a sentence. That's not really a great way to integrate quotes. We need to have them be part of our writing, and that means introducing them and explaining them. So, rule number 2 is that if the quote comes before a group of words, so if it's quote and then words, there needs to be a comma, or it could be an exclamation point or a question mark, and it always, always, always goes inside of the quotation mark. That is so important. So the punctuation goes inside of the quotation mark. So similarly, if there is a couple of words before a quote that could be a full sentence. So if it is, subject, verb. So here we have I as our subject and said as our verb. So that's subject verb. So that's an independent clause. It could be a full sentence. So if we have something that could be a full sentence and then a quote, we need to separate them with a comma. And so this comma goes right after the words that precede the quote. If it is just a fragment or not a full sentence, could just be one word like in this example. That is when you do not need a comma to separate the words from the quote. So again, if it is a subject and verb, if it's a full sentence, a full clause, then it needs a comma before the quote. If it is just a fragment, if it is a dependent clause, could not be a full sentence, then we do not need a comma to separate that word or words from the quote. So, rule number 4, if the quote comes at the end of the sentence, the punctuation will go after the citation. So that is kind of counterintuitive to here, where I said the punctuation will always be inside of the quotation marks. And so the punctuation will always be inside the quotation marks if the quote comes first. If the quote is last, notice that we have our citation, our in-text citation that I will explain in just a minute, but the punctuation is not on the inside of the quotation, it's after the citation. So that's a really tricky one there. We've got our quote, and then a citation, and then the punctuation. And here, this could be a full, full sentence, full idea. And so we have a comma separating that group of words from our quote. So talking a little bit about our in-text citations. And so those in-text citations are what you see here, the parentheses. And so they come at the end of a sentence. They're never in the middle of a sentence. And they explain where that quote, where that information came from. And so here we've got, the text says, and then we've got our quote. And then in parentheses at the end, we've got the author's last name and the page number where that quote can be found. So that is the traditional way that in-text citations look, but there are some variations. And so I don't expect you to memorize these, but if the author's name is said when you're introducing the quote, you do not need to put their name in the parentheses. So if when you're introducing the quote, you say, the author, and you say their name says blah, 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 then you do not need to put the author's name in the parentheses because you've already said it. Similarly, if you say the page number in your introduction of the quote, on page 15, it says blah, blah, then you do not need to put the page number in your parentheses, your in-text citation. And that's just because it's repetitive. You've already said it. But it's always author's last name and then page number. And if you've already said one of those, then you don't need to repeat yourself in the parentheses. And then just to note, the period or the punctuation always goes on the outside of that parentheses after the citation. And so if, remember that, it doesn't come right after the quote, which is a common mistake. People put the parentheses right after the quote and break up the sentence. It never goes in the middle of the sentence. It's always at the end of the sentence. In some texts, this is a really rare thing that you'll see, but some texts have more than one author. And so if it has more than one author, then you write the first two authors' last names. If it only has two, then you stop there. But if it has more than two, then you need to write et al., which is Latin for, and others. If there is no author listed, then you write the title of the book or the article. So, and again, these are a little bit more complicated. You probably won't see these as often, and I'm not expecting you to memorize these. Just expecting you to understand that after a quote or a piece of evidence, you have where that was found, the author's last name and the page number. And if either of those are already said, then you don't need them in your parenthetical citation. So there are a bunch of different ways to introduce quotes. Again, we do not want to just slap a quote in there and have it stand alone as a full sentence. We want to introduce that quote and then explain it. And so there's a bunch of different ways to introduce quotes, but here are a couple. I know this because, the author of the quote says that, blah, 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 blah. This is proven by the quote, blah, blah, blah. And according to author of the quote, blah, blah, blah. So there's a variety of ways that you can introduce quotes, and I put them here for you to reference and use in your writing. So to sum it all up, to go over everything, the first and last sentence of a paragraph should not be a quote. We need to introduce and explain all of our quotes. We need to separate the words that come before the quotation with a comma, if those words could be a full sentence. If the quote starts a sentence, then the punctuation goes inside the quotation marks. So if we have words and then a quote and then more words, we need a comma or a punctuation to end that quote and separate it from the rest of the sentence. And if the quote ends the sentence, the punctuation goes after the in-text citation. So that is all for this lesson. What you are going to do now is go on to answer the questions on the Google form that you will find on your remote English slides. So leave a private comment if you have any questions, and I would recommend that you open up this slides presentation in split screen. This slides presentation is linked in with your Google form. All right. Bye.